Добрый день.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. We are starting the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, following the results of the board meeting. And I would like to give the floor to Elvira Nabiullina to make a statement. Good afternoon. Today, the board of the Bank of Russia made a decision to raise the key rate by 0.25 percentage points up to 7.75 annual percentage points. This step is aimed at limiting the scale of inflationary risks in the forthcoming year. And a little bit later, I will elaborate on the rationale of this decision. Now, the second decision which was made today was to resume regular fiscal rule-based foreign currency purchases, which we will start as of January 15th. And as we said earlier, the postponed purchases will be made gradually in the course of several years. We will decide on the fiscal rule-based foreign currency purchases postponed in 2018 in due course after regular purchases are resumed. We have factored this in our decision and in our forecast. Now, let me say a few words about the key rate. At today's board meeting, we took an in-depth look at the reasoning for both keeping the key rate unchanged and revising it upwards. The main argument in favor of an unchanged key rate is the performance of the domestic demand. It is expanding moderately without posing any inflation risks. This primarily concerns consumption. In October, annual growth of retail sales came in at 1.9%. The heads of the Bank of Russia regional branches who contribute to the key rate decision have also pointed to low demand and mixed consumption dynamics across regions. Annual wage growth has also slowed considerably after peaking early in the year. The savings rate has been recovering in the recent months after a considerable drop in the second and third quarters. Household deposits resumed growth, driven by interest rates attractive to the depositors. In this context, strong growth in retail lending underpins consumer demand without posing inflation risks. The evolution of the household behavior model meets our expectations. However, more arguments call for a key rate hike. What are these arguments? They are associated with both external and domestic factors. External factors include, first, the state of the global economy as a whole and the situation in emerging markets. Certainly, global financial markets have been less volatile this quarter than they were in August and September. This is partially attributed to the revision of monetary policy projections by major central banks. The next year, normalization may prove slower than expected, thus mitigating the risk of capital outflow from emerging markets. However, it is important that the altered projections of policy revision by key central banks are associated with downgraded next year growth forecasts for major economies. Also, the current standstill in trade disputes may merely prove a temporary truce. These risks are quite tangible for emerging market economies. Second, we're in store for the oil glut risk in 2019. This is partially associated with a downward revision of the global demand outlook. However, the main reason is an aggressive expansion of oil production in the US. In early December, OPEC and other oil exporters agreed to cut production in 2019. However, the developments of this year demonstrate that producers can rapidly ramp up shale oil production when prices are high. Another considerable external factor is geopolitical risks affecting both Russia and other countries and regions. As far as internal factors are concerned here, we have persistent uncertainty over the price response to the VAT rate hike. The fact of this year's weakening in the ruble on inflation and its effect on inflation expectations. It means that the uncertainty over price movements is associated with both an estimate, direct effect or pro-inflationary factors, and the scale of secondary effects dependent on inflation expectations. Thus, our baseline scenario assumes that the VAT rise will contribute approximately 1 percentage point to inflation. However, the possible estimates of this contribution range between 0.6 to 1.5 percentage points. The scale of secondary effects is still harder to estimate. Even a temporary acceleration of price growth raises inflation expectations of both households and businesses. We saw it from the surge in petrol prices registered in May-June this year. Petrol prices have been stable in the second half of the year. However, surveys suggest that Russians are highly concerned about the rise in petrol prices. Inflation expectations remain unanchored. This means that they are highly likely to go up in response to price growth following the VAT rate hike. Therefore, we cannot consider the VAT rate revision as a purely one-off factor. Elevated inflation expectations may change consumer behavior and reduce the propensity to save. In these circumstances, firms will have an opportunity to raise retail prices even when the effect of one-off factors is exhausted. If this spiral is set off, inflationary pressure will rise, and inflation may hold above the 4% target for a long period of time. This will require a considerable and enduring monetary policy tightening. The task is to reduce as much as possible the risks of this scenario materializing. In addition, full-year inflation will total about 4% in 2018. This means that we are entering the new year without the inflation buffer we had and with a substantially upgraded inflation forecast for next year. This is why we are raising the key rate at this moment in time. In the context of strengthened risks, it is crucial that we remain proactive. This approach reflects a key inflation targeting policy principle. We look to the outrunning response of monetary policy to enable us to constrain the secondary effects and ensure inflation declines after its temporary rise. We admit that between March and April inflation could exceed 5.5% or even peak to 6%. Its acceleration in the first quarter of 2019 is set to precede its subsequent slowdown. Should we take action to curb the secondary effects, beginning from the second and third quarter of 2019, seasonally adjusted quarterly price growth will total 1 percentage point. That is, it will be consistent with 4% annualized inflation. The residual impact of the one-off factors on annual inflation is set to be entirely gone in 1 year's time in the first quarter of 2020. Now, I will say a few words about the economy and the forecast. Economic growth rates remain close to their potential levels. Unemployment is invariably low and close to its natural rate. But having said that, certain economic activity indicators continue to post a mixed performance. The forecast remains essentially unchanged. Given the state of the global energy market over recent months, we have downgraded the oil price path somewhat in the baseline scenario. The assumption has been updated to reflect faster declining oil prices in the course of 2019, based on the calculation that the average oil price will total $55 per barrel from the previous estimates of $63 a barrel. Moving forward, the average price is set to remain at this level between 2020 and 2021. As before, our approach to oil price assumptions is conservative. The oil price volatility we saw in the fourth quarter, from $85 to $58 per barrel, is an indication of the validity of this approach. The running fiscal rule will ensure that the impact of changing oil prices on economic growth remains limited. We therefore leave our GDP growth forecast unchanged at 1.2 to 1.7% for 2018, admitting it may rise to 2 to 3% in 2021 as the government implements its structural reforms. Changing oil price assumptions have stronger implications for our estimated balance of payments. We now predict the current account balance to stand at $71 billion in US dollars in 2019 compared to $95 billion assumed in October. We have also made a slight downgrade in the financial account balance of the private sector to $20 billion US in comparison to $25 billion US assumed in October. Many will ask why next year's financial account balance of the private sector will make up $20 billion US dollars, whereas it is predicted at $67 billion for this year. Beyond the decline in oil prices, the reason for this is a decision to suspend and subsequently resume fiscal rule-based foreign currency purchases in the market. A positive current account balance is helped by either the build-up of national foreign currency reserves or capital outflow. This is clearly seen from this year's movements in the balance of payments. In the first year half, the current account totaled $49 billion US dollars, with foreign currency reserves at $31 billion, and net capital outflow in the private sector at $13 billion. In the second half of the year, when we moved to suspend foreign currency purchases under the fiscal rule, this ratio reversed. With the current account running at $63 billion US dollars, we expect capital outflow to run at $54 billion and foreign currency reserves to expand by no more than $8 billion US. Capital outflow in the private sector is either repayment of external liabilities or accumulation of foreign assets, including in the form of foreign exchange in foreign bank accounts. Hence, in the second half of the year, when the build-up of government reserves grounds to a halt, a considerable part of export revenue, if unspent to reduce external debt, ultimately settled in bank accounts as extra foreign currency liquidity. Incidentally, this is why the response of the foreign exchange rate to the purchase suspension decision was fairly muted. The market essentially continued to expect their resumption and accumulated assets. Next year, our baseline scenario provides for a return to the 2017-2018 situation, with a significant amount of oil revenues being used to rebuild international reserves and the private sector's capital outflow declining. Importantly, in this logic, we do not foresee a strong response of either the current balance or the foreign currency exchange to resumed purchases. To conclude, let me reiterate that the Bank of Russia will explore the need for further upgrades to the key rate, taking into account inflation and economic developments against the forecast, as well as the risks of external conditions and the response of financial markets. In the current context, it is crucial that our approach remains conservative as we assess risks and conduct monetary policy. Inflation stays close to 4%. More so, it has never climbed above this figure since the second half of 2017, although the rise in inflation early next year is set to be driven by transient factors, considering the need to limit their negative effects and ensure a speedy return of inflation to 4% level. It is critical that the response of monetary policy is well timed. A consistently conservative monetary policy stance will enable us to curb both inflation risks and the response of inflation expectations. This will lay the groundwork for looser monetary policy by late 2019, early 2020, if the situation unfolds consistent with our forecast. And before I proceed to answer your questions, let me also inform you about the changes we want to introduce beginning in March 2019 as regards our communications related to key rate decisions. First, a key rate press release in the follow-up to our policy board meeting will include a forecast of the board, and secondly, a monetary policy report will be published in a week after the board meeting. These arrangements will serve to better reflect the logic of the already made decision. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. Well, dear colleagues, let us now open the Q&A, and I would like to remind you not to forget to introduce yourselves and name your agency. Gulia, please. Elvira Nabiullina, the central bank in its press release retains the signal about the possibility of further key rate hike preliminarily in September, saying that you may resort back to your monetary policy. Can we consider this particular signal as the start of the upwards moving cycle? No, that is not the right way to consider it, because traditionally the key rates raising cycle or toughening of the key rate cycle is related to cool down the overheated demand. We're not in such an environment. We act in a preemptive way by responding to the inflation risks that we see and the probability of which is now stronger. And so for the future, we consider different optionalities depending upon the way things unfold. Zhenya, please. Bloomberg. Evgenia Pismenaya. You raised the rate in September, and in those days you also explained it by the faster inflation. Can one construe that today's rate hike didn't work the right way, because then it was told that 6% as a risk because sanctions may affect inflation? Does it mean that the second rate hike that the inflation may be above 6% in the pessimistic scenarios that you assume? Another interesting question, did you take into account the pressure upon the ruble because of the resuming currency purchases as a result of the rate hike? That was my first question. And my second question about the currency purchases. You said that the postponed currency purchases in 2018 is what you're going to decide upon past January or during January. But generally speaking, what are the strategy options that you may follow? Is it going to be some sort of a formula, or will it depend upon the market environment? So what do you expect? What kind of scenarios you may follow in as far as this postponed currency purchases are concerned? Thank you. Well, indeed, we do consider the possible inflation peak for March and April, first and foremost, because of the VAT hike. And during the peak period, we look at our basic scenario is that inflation can be about 5.5, closer to 6%, give or take. Now, and as far as the way the situation changed compared to September, it is true that certain changes did take place in the oil market. You all witnessed this. And the situation in the emerging markets, on the one hand, seems that conversely the markets have calmed down because they are expecting slower rates of the monetary policy normalization in the United States. But nevertheless, these expectations constitute the response to the global economy forecasts declines, and that is a material risk for the emerging market economies. In our forecast, we definitely took into account the resumption of currency purchases, but in our decision-making today, that was not the main driver. And so I listed the kind of drivers that we took into account. As far as the deferred purchases are concerned, this is the kind of a decision that we're definitely going to revisit after the regular purchases resume after January 15th. At this point in time, we are not able to tell you exactly when, because we need to take a look at the way the whole situation carries forward and assess the effect of the way the market may respond to us resuming our regular purchases, although we do believe that it's not going to be significant. And we will also need to discuss the strategy. And as far as the strategy is concerned, we are certainly, in as far as these deferred purchases are concerned, we will be compensating for them within an extensive period of time, which may run for several years. We intend to do this gradually in a very even way. And again, the decision to resume purchases will be made irrespective of the exchange rate level. Colleagues, please. Margarita. Thank you very much, Mrs. Shapirevska, Task Agency. Elvira Nabiullina, have you changed your vision of the way the lending to the economy is going to take place because of some of the adjustments of the forecast and in alternative scenarios? Your understanding of the future of the oil prices, has it changed at all? In the oil price alternative scenarios, they remain as they have been. $75 is the scenario with high prices, and $35 per barrel is the risk-based scenario. And as far as the economic lending rates are concerned, a slight adjustment for 2018 in the estimates of what is currently taking place right now, just by 1 percentage point lower. For 2019, 2021, we didn't change our expectations. We do assess the lending activity as an adequate one in line with the economic recovery. Anton, please. In the 11th of November, when you were talking about resuming your currency purchases, you were mentioning the date of 2025. Could you please tell us, 2021, is it remaining as the target year? Because you are making reference to the next 2 years. When we were preparing our main document, which is the fundamentals of our monetary policy, trying to make our calculation for the next 3 years to come, we were indeed looking into the compensation for the delayed purchases until 2021 as a certain estimate modeling. And this is a plausible option, but to be certain whether it will be until the end of 2021 or slightly earlier or slightly later, we will be in this position after we make a decision to resume purchases, not rather resuming our purchases, but resuming the delayed, postponed purchases. And once we start them and we assess all of the factors, but once again, we base our approach on understanding that this period of time is going to be sufficiently durable. In several years, maybe 3 years. It's just that we cannot ultimately tell you that it's going to be 3 years and not something else. Dear colleagues, let me just quickly interrupt you because we are receiving questions from the regional media. Let me read out one of them. It is from Anton Tsipilo, senior editor of a networking media outlet, 56 Media, that's the name of it, from Orenburg. He is asking, can one say that the effect from the key rate change will reach out to the different regions of Russia at different times? For example, if the Moscow prices may respond to it quicker than the prices in Yekaterinburg or in Orenburg. If positive, do such processes of regional lags are taken into account in your decision-making with respect to the key rate change? When we were making our decision about changing or not changing the rate, we do rely upon the national trends and national indicators, but at the same time, we also consider the regional dynamics. And that is why for some time back, we introduced this practicality to invite to the meeting of the board of directors the heads of our regional banks who, in a very elaborate way, are telling us about the regional economy, what is happening with inflation, what are the inflation expectations, which is a very important point to us. And at the same time, we are aware that our decision about the key rate and any changes to it translate down to the regions differently, with a different lag, as was correctly noticed, dependent upon what is the structure of the financial markets locally, what is the structure, and what is how the real sector in the economy is doing, depending upon the different competition level, what kind of inflation expectations. There is one-off factors. For example, in the Orenburg region, where the farming is so well developed, the general inflation for some time was staying below the Russia average one, thanks to some good yield. So currently it is nudging up to the average Russian level again. So these are the kind of considerations that we need to take into account. Yes, indeed, down in the regions, our decisions manifest themselves in different ways. But while monitoring the regional economic development, we certainly make a single decision within the monetary policy environment effective for the whole of the country, trying to rely upon the national trends. Thank you. Oh, so many questions coming. Nastya, please. Interfax Agency. My first question is, doesn't central bank currently see the need to resume the currency refinancing, the currency repo? And do you expect any demand growth for this particular instrument from the banks? And the second question is not so much about the monetary policy. Central bank gave to the VEB the money to take out of the crisis. Swiss is currently being proposed to give to the EU bank, and this money is suggested that it should be converted into a subordinated instrument that is reflected into the capital. What CB thinks about it, and so what do they think about giving Swiss bank to Prom Swiss bank? Thank you very much for your questions. From the point of view of the currency refinancing, this is the kind of the instrument that we always have at our disposal. If we need it, we will use it, but currently we don't see that we need to resort to it. The situation with the currency liquidity is normal, and there's no indicators of the demand strengthening within the immediate future is what we don't see. But again, I shall say that we've got this instrument in our toolkit, and so if we feel like it, we will use it. As far as the second question is concerned, this topic is currently being discussed together with the VEB. Indeed, VEB Bank came up with a proposition to give it to the Promsvest Bank, and so we are considering the details of the situation. And it also came up with an offer to convert the subordinated instruments as part of this lending arrangement. It is currently being debated. Dmitry, please. Good afternoon, Dmitry Butrenko, Kommersant. To the extent I understand, this is the third board meeting, the decision of which was not guessed by the majority of the analysts. In the course of your deliberations, the board of central bank, generally, the analysts' forecasts, are they being taken into account, and whether they're going to guess right or not? Do you believe it is important for your decision-making process? Whenever we debate the key rate issue, we certainly do take a look at the analyst forecast, because our Department of Monetary Policy prepares such reviews. I cannot say that they guessed or not didn't guess, but the opinions between analysts really split in 50-50, almost evenly. Actually, the markets were rather inclined to expect the rate to grow. But what is important to us? We very much would dislike to see the analysts acting on their principles, whether they would be able to guess or not guess what the central bank decides. We would prefer the analysts to understand the rationale that we follow when we decide, and the factors that we take into account, and we believe it is very important to pursue the policy of transparency, improving our communications in order to have the analysts have a better understanding of our logic. Yes, please, Andrei. Good afternoon. Andrei Berikov from Bloomberg. Could you please comment on the oil price forecast decline? Because you mentioned one of the reasons was the volatility over the past few months, but nevertheless, you reduced your forecast already after OPEC made a decision to cut off production for the next year. Do I understand correctly that you're not a strong believer in the strength of this agreement, and despite of it, the oil price will continue going down? We do see the risk of the oil price going downward because of the supply and demand situation related to the global economic trends, because actually we see the way the forecast for the global economic growth rates start declining. And the second factor, the growth of the shale oil production in the US, which exceeded many an expectation, and the OPEC Plus deal, which enables one to curb these risks rather, but not eliminate them. That was why we have somewhat reduced our expectations for the oil price future. Elena, please. Elena Fabrichneva, Reuters. Some analysts still do hope that the Bank of Russia shall resume regular currency purchases as of January, not in full scale, at half-force or, depending upon what's the environment. Can you comment on that? No, we anticipate to resume our purchases full swing. And colleagues, please. Yes, Anatoly. Anatoly Kurmanaev from Wall Street Journal. What should change in the external environment for you to change your conservative approach in your monetary policy? Well, I believe that we shall remain for a long time demonstrating a conservative approach in our monetary policy, and it's not the question of anything changing in the external markets or reassessing what we think about it. We are a country with a very young inflation targeting regime, and certainly one should have certain credibility towards inflation always remaining under control. I've already mentioned that as of the middle of 2017, we've been able to stay below our target, but within a historical perspective, that is a very short period of time, and the inflation expectations are unanchored. I would rather answer your question in this way, that we would be slightly less conservative if we notice that the inflation expectations get anchored. Sasha, please. Good afternoon. Alexander Suarva, Russia 24. I've got two questions. The first one, possible sanctions that we hear about. To what extent the central bank takes these into account? I mean, the forecast for the sanctions when they decide on anything. And the second question, there's an active speculation about the possible sale of Alpha Bank. To what extent do you notice the strand for the banking sector to become stronger? Well, in as far as the sanctional and geopolitical risks are concerned, we certainly do take these into account as one of a significant set of factors when putting together our economic growth forecasts. But I would like to say that, generally speaking, the economy adapts itself to such sanctions, and we do see that the rates of growth are close to the potential ones. Yes, of course, we taken into account. You cannot but take into account, but it has a limited kind of an effect. Now, in as far as the banking system having bigger government penetration into them, many relate this to our decision to revoke licenses and generally improve the operations of the banking system. While from the very beginning the share of the government ownership in the banks was high, but I would only reiterate our policy approach. As soon as we're ready, we will let these banks start, operating on their own. And we are interested in having our banks private and not become real market operators, as long as they're stable, reliable, and duly protect the rights of depositors and investors. RIA Novosti. Elvira Nabiullina, has the central bank retained its assessment of the long-term equal key rate, and has it calculated the effect of the ruble effect upon inflation as a result of 2017? Thank you. Our estimate for the long-term neutral rate is what we haven't changed, but I should comment that the neutral rate is something which is quite conditional, very hard to estimate it as a value. In as far as the currency exchange rate effect on inflation weakening, yes, we estimated it, and if annualized, this is 0.9%. Colleagues, please, Katya. I have two questions. First one is about resuming your currency purchases. Do you intend to change the form of the way you do it? And my second question is related to the American-Chinese trade war. A truce has been achieved recently. To what extent do you believe this trend may sustain? And do you believe that it may transform itself into some sort of a durable deal? And what are your expectations in terms of the Russian economy being affected by it? Thank you very much for your questions. As far as the regular purchases are concerned, we're not intending to change our formula. It will remain as it has been. And as far as the economic relations between the United States and China are concerned, and the risks of the trade wars, this is a considerable risk for the global economy, I mean, such trade wars. And that is why we hope that the truce achieved will be a stable one, but nevertheless the risks are there, and such risks on the side of the global economic growth rates is what we take into account in our forecast. Dear colleagues, please, Nastya. Elvira Nabiullina, does the central bank retain the right to stop the regular currency purchases again, or possibly, postpone the intended currency purchases in case the volatility in the market grows, possibly because of the very same sanctions? We began considering putting such currency purchases on hold as part of the fiscal rule, which we can apply if the risks to financial stability arise indeed, but not necessarily. For example, if the financial stability risks appear, we're going to apply these kind of instruments, because we also have in our toolkit certain other instruments, and so depending upon the exact situation, we will decide what to do. Currently, we don't see any risk like that. Colleagues, so we're soon going to wrap up, so 2 final questions, please. Margarita. Thank you. Before, you stated that the regulators don't rule out in December to discuss the measures of the cooling down of the unsupported consumer purchasing, consumer demand. What is going to be your approach to it? Yes, unsupported consumer lending has been growing at a very high rate. We introduced certain regulatory measures as of the beginning of September. In the meantime, the effect over the 3 months period is not very strong, and so in a certain period of time, I do not rule out that we will revisit this issue again. The unsupported consumer lending as a rate in terms of its growth is not speeding up, but is not slowing down again, so we don't rule out that we will definitely reconsider this. Zhenya, please. My question is an extension of what my colleague previously asked about Alpha Bank. Could you please tell us? I understand that you will say no to this question, but nevertheless, my question is this. Could you possibly, I mean, I'm not talking about trying to take a sinking bank, but the possibility of having a private bank being bought by the government bank. I will respond in the following way. We supported the initiative by the anti-monopoly agency to limit the rights of the government banks to acquire private banks. Well, dear colleagues, thank you very much for your questions.